Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm George Paik. I'm the Interim Executive Director of the World Affairs Forum. For those who don't know, the Forum was founded in 1946. It's a nonpartisan, not-for-profit with the mission of expanding understanding of world affairs and America's role in the world. This is the last program of our program year, and we expect it to be the last Zoom event for some while. We are planning for live in-person events in the fall. Planning still in progress, but mark your calendars for September 9th, and we hope to have a breakfast that would be in a format that would be familiar to a lot of people. Also look for, watch our site and watch our notices for upcoming events. We may have some low-key things into the summer. Today's event, before I get to the actual content of it, we're going to try something after the formal program. We're going to ask people to hang around who want to, and we will divide you into breakout rooms where you can have private discussions and digest your feelings about everything relevant to this topic. So just hang on afterwards and we'll proceed with that. You'll be in the rooms for 20 minutes and we'll come back together and check out. So for now, housekeeping, we'll all be muted while Professor Inboden speaks. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat and I'll be just tracing through them and try to make for a nice conversation afterwards. So with that out of the way, our speaker is William Inboden. He's the William Powers Jr. Executive Director of the Clements Center for National Security and a distinguished scholar at the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. This is all housed at the University of Texas, Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs. Is that correct, strictly speaking?
Yes.
Yes. He's also a National Intelligence Council Associate, serves on the CIA's Historical Advisory Panel and State Department's Historical Advisory Committee. He's previously been in government as Senior Director for Strategic Planning at the National Security Council. He's been on the policy planning staff at State, which is the George Kennan invented office, if you will, and has served as a congressional staff member. He has think tank experience with the American Enterprise Institute and with the London-based Legatum Institute, and is Council of Foreign Relations Life member, contributing editor to Foreign Policy magazine. His commentary has appeared with all the big boys. You can, if you Google him, I'm sure you'll get maybe half of them. And his classes, Ethics in International Relations and Presidential Decision-Making and National Security, has been a favorite at the LBJ School. Well, our notes say he is writing, but I believe you just finished the project for your book on Reagan, titled The Peacemaker, the Reagan Presidency. Is that correct?
Yeah, I finished my part. It's with the editor in the production process now. So the book won't be appearing in print for another 6 months or so. But the hard part was of researching and writing is done.
Oh, so keep your eyes peeled for this one. And I will say a little research turns up. Our topic is a long-standing interest of his. There's a 2008 book called Religion in American Foreign Policy, The Soul of Containment. And it says that this interest goes back to your grad school days at Yale, where you have your PhD in history. Is that correct?
Yes, that is, yeah.
Great. So we will have our speaker. We will be followed by our group Q&A, and then hang around for breakout groups. And without further ado, Will Inboden, thank you very much for being here.
Okay, well, thank you, George, and great to be with everybody today. I was especially honored to be invited when I heard that you had heard from my good friend Richard Fontaine, a longtime colleague going back to our time together in the Bush administration. And as I looked over the other speakers you had, I was happy to see that many are friends of mine, and the ones I don't know are ones I've admired their work. So honored to be one of your speakers, and as I just gathered, your last Zoom speaker. So I think we're all very excited to be transitioning back to in-person events now that we're, at least our country is coming out of the worst of this awful COVID plague. So, but Zoom does have some advantages we've seen, such as that I can dial in from 100-degree Austin, Texas, to your gathering there in Connecticut, where I very much enjoyed my years living when I was at Yale. All right, so to the topic at hand. This is, as George mentioned, longtime interest of mine, certainly dating back to my graduate studies and also relating to some of my work in government, both on Capitol Hill and at the State Department. And so rather than trying to solve the entire vast lifelong riddle of religion and foreign policy, I just want to share a few ways that I think we should think about it, understand its importance, give some categories for what it does and does not mean, as well as drawing on a few examples from history and from my own policy work. First observation is that for most of post-war America's years, policymakers and scholars largely ignored or downplayed the importance of religion in foreign policy. Foreign policy was seen to be largely driven by economic interests or security interests, or nationalist ideas, or other ideologies, but religion was just not seen to be very, very important. But a series of events provided a shock to the system, if you will, for foreign policy experts on maybe we've been missing something here. The first big one was the 1979 Iranian Revolution, one of the worst intelligence failures in modern American history, where the CIA just completely missed the Shah's religious radicalism and the Ayatollah's religious radicalism that was going to topple the Shah. Because CIA analysts and State Department diplomats just were not taking religion very seriously as a motivator for the Iranian revolutionaries. And so after missing that revolution, there was a beginning of thinking, maybe we missed something here. Maybe because we were only looking at economic and political factors, not religious influences. That's one reason why this was such a strategic shock and an intelligence failure. Another example is, in some ways in a more positive way, is the surprise of the peaceful end of the Cold War. And again, that's a complicated story with many different factors. As George mentioned, I cover a few of those in my forthcoming book on Reagan administration foreign policy. But looking back, it's quite clear that religious actors, such as Pope John Paul II or Lutheran pastors behind the Iron Curtain in East Germany, certainly Jewish refuseniks in the Soviet Union, religious actors played a pretty important role in the peaceful end of the Cold War and the fall of Soviet communism. Again, and one reason why that caught a lot of the foreign policy expert community, by surprise, was because they were still trained in a more secular outlook that just did not pay much attention to religion. And then finally, the other strategic shock, again, on the unhappier side of the ledger, was the 9/11 attacks. Of course, religiously inspired, fanatical jihadists and the awful carnage that they wrought on our country. And again, a lot of reasons for that intelligence failure, but part of it seems to have been not paying more careful attention to the religious roots of jihadist ideology. And as George mentioned, I first discovered some of this neglect of religion and its role in foreign policy during my time in graduate school, when I was beginning to poke around in what later became my dissertation and then first book on the religious influences on early American Cold War policy, including on George Kennan, who was mentioned earlier as the founder of the State Department's policy planning staff. And even though many other good books had been written on, the first 15 years of the Cold War, that 1945 to 1960 window, just about all of them completely overlooked religious motivations. And yet, when I was doing some of my own research into Truman and Eisenhower's private papers, as well as their speeches, or some of their chief policymakers, such as Secretary of State Dean Acheson or Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, realized, wow, a lot of these architects of early American Cold War policy, even of the containment doctrine, including George Kennan himself, saw this as a religious conflict, saw this as the religious, God-fearing West against the atheistic Soviet communist bloc. And so that was a clue for me that just as while policymakers ignoring religion too much in the contemporary context, perhaps they had been overlooking it in the past as well. Now, over the last couple of decades, this has begun to change. Religion is not nearly as neglected in foreign policy, either in scholarship or statecraft as it used to be. I still think perhaps more attention needs to be paid. It still can be seen as somewhat of an unusual blending of topics, but not like the neglect there was 20 or 25 years ago. So in the last 20 years, there have been many very good books on the topic, certainly by a lot of scholars, but also by policymakers, such as former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who wrote a really interesting book called The Mighty and the Almighty after her time as Secretary of State, talking about the importance of religion in foreign policy. And likewise, in the policy realm, the State Department now has a dedicated office following religion and religious freedom. There's more training for our diplomats on understanding religious factors. The intelligence community pays a lot more attention to religion. We have quite a few analytical specialists on religion. And then, think tanks such as the Council on Foreign Relations have dedicated programs on religion and foreign policy. So more attention is being paid to it now, which I think is a good thing. But it's one thing to say that it matters. It's another thing to understand why, and then sometimes why not. Why not? Obviously, my bias, which I'll be laying out here, is why I do think religion is overall very important for understanding foreign policy, but it's not always the case. And sometimes other factors are as important, if not more important. So I think there are three mistakes that partisans and advocates can sometimes make in arguing about this topic, religion and foreign policy. The first mistake is the assumption that religion is always good. Sometimes dedicated religious believers will make that assumption that anytime you have religion involved with foreign policy, it's going to be a good thing. The second mistake is the opposite one, the assumption that religion is always bad. Anytime you let those religious people or religious beliefs get involved, it's going to be a bad thing. And then the third mistake is the assumption that one still finds in some quarters, even if it's less prevalent, that religion is specious and irrelevant. Okay, so if those are the mistakes, what's the proper or the better way to think about it? I'll suggest this as a start. The best assumption to start with is that religion is often powerful. And I use those words, often powerful, very, very deliberately. Why? Well, powerful because it can be the primary motivating force in the lives of individuals and communities and nations, whether for good or for ill. People will die for their faith and people will kill for their faith. So any factor that will motivate you to take those, the ultimate steps that a human being can take relating to matters of life and death, that certainly needs to be, attention must be paid, right? That means it's powerful. But I said often because religion isn't always going to be the most important factor in a particular set of foreign policy considerations in the past or present. At times it might be a secondary or even a marginal concern. And so I think carefully thinking about it and studying it, means taking religion seriously as a powerful motivator, but not over determining it where we always want to assume that it's going to be the main factor. And I used to lecture on this topic when I was at the State Department to new classes of foreign service officers. And I would often try to make the point, because sometimes these discussions immediately get into whatever people's personal religious beliefs are. And I think those can be illuminating, but they should not be the main way we approach this. And so what I would say to the new State Department officers is religion should matter to you on a professional level because it matters to most of the rest of the world. Certainly outside of, say, Europe and North America, most of the rest of the world is still quite religious. And if you're going to be a good diplomat involved with the rest of the world, you need to understand what matters most to people in the rest of the world. And then I would point out, just look at many of the most pressing international issues of the recent past, and you'll often find a religious dimension. Not always, but often. I could rattle off the list: the Northern Ireland conflict and the fault lines between Protestants and Catholics. Certainly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and some of the turbulence there. The Sri Lankan civil war, the Syrian civil war, tensions between India and Pakistan, or even some tensions within India and within Pakistan. Nigeria's communal strife, the Balkans, Iran's nuclear program. Most, but not all, but most conflicts in the world today have some sort of religious dimension. But religion can play a positive role as well in peace and reconciliation. And religious actors and identities can oftentimes be the key determinants in successful outcomes. And again, this was the case with the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. It took, Protestant and Catholic religious leaders, as well as, of course, political actors to come together, drawing on the better peacemaking resources of their faith to come to that settlement. Likewise, the remarkable reconciliation that has taken place in Rwanda, between the Hutus and Tutsis after the horrific 1994 genocide led by religious actors. Even going back into history, the Franco-German reconciliation after World War II, how France and West Germany were able to go from mortal enemies to being the foundation states for what became the European Union as well as NATO, largely led by religious actors, or the Camp David Accords, the peaceful end of the Cold War, as I mentioned earlier. Well, then let's take a particular foreign policy challenge today. The rise of China. I'm sure you've had a number of speakers on that. I hope you'll continue to have a number of speakers on that. None of us can learn too much about China. But if you look at a lot of the major issues in China, especially on the democracy and human rights front, many of them have a religious dimension. First and foremost, of course, is the horrific mistreatment. I do think it is the genocide of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, but also the plight of the Tibetan Buddhists, the democracy protests in Hong Kong, largely led by Catholic and Protestant activists, or the fact that the Chinese Communist Party blames religion for the fall of the Soviet Union. They may even over-exaggerate it, but that's certainly a clue to why Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party are so repressive and controlling of religion, is they think that it was the main factor in the fall of the Soviet Union and the fall of Soviet communism, and that's a fate that they want to avoid. Or shifting over to another geopolitical challenge, which President Biden is addressing as we speak in his summit meeting with Putin in Geneva. You cannot understand Vladimir Putin and the last 2 decades of resurgent Russian nationalism without the role of the Russian Orthodox Church, in a lot of ways as kind of being a main instrument and glue of that nationalism. Or if we want to go into the realm of development aid and humanitarian relief, many of the world's largest development organizations are religiously affiliated, and religious actors have inspired some of the most significant government programs. Reinhold Niebuhr, the theologian, played an important role in helping craft and then lead support for the Marshall Plan. Many American Christian groups, Catholic and Protestant, helped inspire the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief. The $15 billion the United States has allocated to HIV/AIDS treatment and relief in sub-Saharan Africa. I could go on. So the point being, I just wanted to give you that overview of many important foreign policy issues in the world today. Some solutions, some problems are going to have a religious dimension. Okay, to think about it, putting my scholarly hat on a little bit more here, to think about ways that religion actually can be a unique factor in foreign policy. I just want to share a few. First is what scholars call a meta-narrative, M-E-T-A narrative. This is a story or a worldview that exists outside the individual and purports to define the past, the present, and the future, as well as the individual's relationship to a larger community. It's a belief system that addresses not only who am I, the big existential question, but also what is the nature of the world and what's my role in it. Now, totalitarian ideologies such as Marxism and Nazism, they had their own meta-narratives, quite iniquitous and damaging ones. That's why they were known as secular religions. But religious religions involving belief in the supernatural and the transcendent, also create that totalizing belief system, if you will, that meta-narrative for its adherents. The second unique factor about religion and foreign policy are the demands of conscience. And so religion makes what we call normative demands on its followers. It makes demands about this is what you ought to do. This is the way that you should live your life. This is what right is. This is what wrong is. And these go beyond just mere personal identity, but to include morality and worship and the types of people that you are in community with. So it's as much about what ought to be done as who a person is. And so for religious believers, these demands of conscience can be the highest calling, even higher than the laws of the state. It's one reason why the Chinese Communist Party is so threatened by religion. And these demands of conscience can shape the decision-making of everybody from a head of state. Many world leaders have been very devoutly religious who feel like they're carrying out their religious duties in whatever particular policies they're pushing, to then dissidents who are resisting the state as well. So the demands of conscience are the second important factor. The third one is the collective role of religion. This is building on the part about the demands of conscience, but religion's normative moral obligations and meta-narratives can apply to nations as well as individuals, and they can apply to tribes or ethnic groups or any other matter of human organization. So religion can really shape an entire nation's belief in its role and its purpose in the world. Some of the American Christian traditions have certain beliefs about a divine calling for America's role in the world. This is one way to understand the Iranian revolutionary regime and its understanding of its role in the world. This can apply irrespective of different religions. Now, the fourth one, again, builds on that third. If the third one was about kind of the collective identity and calling that religion can bring, the fourth is its transnational character. And so while religion can get blended with national identities, as we've already mentioned, Hinduism in India, Judaism in Israel, the Orthodox Church in Russia, Tibetan Buddhism, Italian Catholicism, these phrases that roll off our tongue. Virtually every world religion is also transnational and extends across borders. And so this can create religious identities that transcend national identities. So this, to give an example closer to home, some American Christians will say that they feel deeper spiritual bonds with their fellow Christians in Kenya or in China than they might feel with their fellow Americans who are not Christians. And people of other religious faiths would say the same as well. And so that's the transnational character of religion. And the final one to emphasize, and this is a little bit more of an academic term that some of you may be familiar with, others not, is the eschatological dimension of religion. And this is eschatological. And this is eschatology, or the eschaton, refers to the end times, or an eternal reality beyond time and beyond this particular world. And this is something that even distinguishes, say, religion from other meta-narratives such as communism. Religion believes that actions that take place in this world are very much influenced by eternal perspectives, and can in turn shape the nature of the world to come. So whether it's Hindu doctrines of reincarnation, or Christian beliefs in heaven, or Shiism's belief in the hidden 12th Imam. Almost every religion has some sort of belief about the eschaton, about what comes after this particular life. And if you want to understand how and why people are making certain foreign policy decisions, or even larger communities or nations may understand their role in the world, you've got to understand, what do they think about the world to come, or the next world. Now, it also bears, so those are the 5 unique factors, but here's another wrinkle or complication, even as I'm wanting to make the case for how important religion is that religion very rarely dictates a single policy position any more than other important factors such as economics or security are going to dictate a single policy position. So what I mean is, religious influences and religious believers can contend for peace or for war, for armament or for disarmament, for free trade or for protectionism, for democracy or for authoritarianism. And sometimes these different beliefs about a foreign policy position will take place within the same religious tradition. Just to give you a few examples, mostly from American history. One that I uncovered in my graduate school and put in my first book was American Protestant missionaries to China in the late 1940s, around the time of the Communist Revolution, the 1949 takeover by the Chinese Communist Party. After the Chinese Communist Party founded the People's Republic of China, and Chiang Kai-shek and nationalists fled to Taiwan and set up the Republic of China there, the United States had a big debate. Should we extend diplomatic recognition to the People's Republic of China, or should we keep recognition to the Republic of China on Taiwan? Well, American missionaries to China got very involved in that debate as well. And here's the interesting thing. They were deeply divided. And this was not even across denominational lines. You had Baptist missionaries arguing among themselves, some saying, yes, we should recognize the People's Republic. Others saying, no, we shouldn't. Same with Methodist missionaries, Presbyterian missionaries, and so often. It's slightly risque, but in my book, I call these debates the debate over the missionary position. What is the right position the missionary should have on the recognition of China? Similarly, in the 1980s, I worked on this in my the forthcoming book on Reagan's foreign policy. American evangelical and Catholic groups had big debates among themselves. Some of you may remember these over the nuclear freeze, right? Should American Christians support a nuclear freeze? You know, Billy Graham came out in favor of it. Pope John Paul II was very sympathetic to it. Other Protestants and Catholics said, no, we should not support a nuclear freeze. That would just give an advantage to the Soviet Union. And both of them were arguing from their own particular Christian commitments, and very sincerely. So I don't say this by way of criticism, but just to show that these issues are very complicated, and people can, argue for very different positions, even if they have the same religious convictions. Somewhat more recently, about 25 years ago, when I was working in Congress, the debate at the time was, should the United States support China entering the World Trade Organization? Of course, this has been, revisited more recently. Did we make a mistake with our policy of economic engagement? And I'm not here to relitigate that one way or another, but was very interesting was seeing, again, that American Christian groups argued on both sides of it. Some of them very strongly, led by Billy Graham, very strongly advocated for economic engagement with China and for supporting China to join the World Trade Organization. And they would argue things like, if we can bring China into the international economic order, they'll also be more open to Bibles and to missionaries and supporting religious freedom. Other American Christians said, no, we should not give China those economic rewards and inducements. It will just enrich this communist regime and encourage, or at least facilitate, their further religious persecution. So again, I could give you many other examples, the Iraq War, counterterrorism policy, even a number of the debates today. The point being is that religious believers do not always come out on the same side, even when they are arguing from religious convictions for a policy issue. But that doesn't mean that those religious convictions don't matter. It just shows how complex these things are. Finally, before I wrap up and we go to Q&A, just a few thoughts on what this might look like in practice, or what this is beginning to look like in practice on one particular slice of policymakers paying more attention to religion and one of its corollaries, which is religious freedom. And this is the question of, can promoting or paying more attention to religious freedom and religious persecution help address American national security concerns, particularly the possibility of growing security threats. And I think there's three ways that religious freedom can be better integrated with, and this has certainly been starting to be the case over the last 10, 15 years in the Obama and Trump administrations, integrated with national security policy. The first one is what we might call the diagnostic role. So religious freedom violations, religious persecution, regimes that are especially targeting religious believers, that can sometimes be a leading indicator of an emerging security threat. And this is, of course, the intelligence community's one of their main purposes is how can we identify and predict emerging security threats. And I and others have argued, and we've certainly seen the CIA doing more of this, paying attention to what the religious actors are doing, especially if there's growing religious repression, can sometimes indicate an emerging security threat. And I'll give you a couple of examples. The first would be Afghanistan in the late 1990s. So in the late 1990s, the Taliban had just taken over Afghanistan, several years after the Soviet exit at the end of the Cold War. And most foreign policy professionals, no one liked the Taliban, but very few foreign policy professionals thought that what was going on in Afghanistan rose to the level of a national security threat or a national security concern. It was more of an unfortunate humanitarian disaster. But there were two particular communities who started paying a lot more attention to what the Taliban was doing. And these were religious freedom advocates and women's rights advocates. And this is, again, way before September 11th. And the religious freedom advocates said, look, this group just, blew up those historic Buddhas, the Buddhas of Banyan. They have been, viciously repressing other Sunni Muslims who don't share their extremist version of Sunni Islam. They're targeting Shia Muslims. They're targeting the very few Christians in the country. We really need to pay attention to this. This is a real concern. But many other foreign policy professionals said, well, that's unfortunate, but it's just not. It is not in the national interest of the United States to get involved there. But what was going on is those same religious freedom violations that were so appalling to the religious freedom in religious communities in the United States were very appealing to Osama bin Laden. That's why bin Laden and his al-Qaeda cells had wanted to set up shop in Afghanistan. And so it's not a perfect correlation, but I do think it's very clear in hindsight that paying more attention to that emerging religious persecution has also shown that this is something very attractive to a militant jihadist group and a terrorist safe haven, certainly one that, of course, did great harm to the United States. Another example is also Russia in the late 1990s. Many of you may remember after the collapse of the Soviet Union during the 1990s, there were certainly hopes that Russia would become a market democracy, and Russia under Boris Yeltsin started taking some tentative steps in that direction, obviously amidst much chaos and corruption and failed governance. But around 1997-98. Some Russian nationalists, and Putin, though out of power, was certainly a leading voice on this, started pushing for much more repressive laws against any non-Russian Orthodox faith communities, especially Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Muslims, and even some Protestant groups. And again, the religious freedom activists became agitated over this, and were encouraging the American government to get more involved. But we can now look in hindsight and see that early religious persecution and religious nationalism was one of the preconditions for Russia's turn back to authoritarianism under Vladimir Putin, and then its aggressive behavior. And again, there's other complicating factors there, so I don't want to oversimplify this, but that's what I mean about religious persecution being a diagnostic that policymakers should take more seriously. Even if they're not religious themselves, this could indicate an emergent security threat. I'll just quickly mention two others, and we can go to the Q&A. The second one is the more positive ameliorative, that religious freedom can help function as a mitigating factor in reducing existing security threats. So Pakistan is an example I've used here before. Pakistan, obviously a very fragile state dealing with terrorist support within their own intelligence community and military. And certainly some radical jihadists exerting more and more influence in the government, but also some democratic elements as well. But one of the accelerants of all this are Pakistan's blasphemy laws, which make it a capital crime to utter any sort of blasphemy against the Prophet Muhammad. And the militants in Pakistan have really used the blasphemy laws as a way of persecuting women and religious minorities, especially Ahmadi Muslims and Pakistani Christians. And those blasphemy laws have really accelerated radicalism and extremism in Pakistan. And many analysts have long believed, and I think this is true, that if the blasphemy laws were repealed, that doesn't mean it would solve all of Pakistan's problems, but it would take away an instrument that those radicals have been using to foment security threats. And then finally, I would say the preventive aspect. And two scholars, Brian Grimm and Roger Finke, have done a whole book on how societies, nations that respect religious freedom are more peaceful and prosperous. And ensuring religious freedom protections can really play a constructive role in states that don't necessarily now pose a security threat, but are at a vulnerable crossroads in their development. And Grimm and Finke put it this way: the higher the degree to which governments and societies ensure religious freedoms for all, the less violent religious persecution and conflict there will be. So as hard as this is to implement in practice, certainly when we're looking at post-conflict stabilization operations, state building, development policy, democratization, I think it's an important principle for fragile states and state reconstruction after conflict to try to build in some sort of protections for religious pluralism and religious freedom as a way of acknowledging the religious identities there, which could be, can lead on a constructive path to peace and coexistence, or if repressed, could lead to more violence and instability. So, okay, enough from me. Thanks for your patience. I hope you found this stimulating and edifying, and would be happy to take any questions or any comments. So over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Will. Everything from from the deep theory to the issues of the day. I think there's a lot to digest for a lot of us. Listen, folks, first of all, I'll look to the chat box to take questions. We've had a couple questions already in a couple of different channels. So while some of you are digesting that, I can't resist this, Will. You mentioned missionaries, particularly in Asia. There's a long history of missionaries, Protestant missionaries in Asia. And actually, I'm named after another Yale history PhD who studied under Kenneth Scott Latourette in 1927. So I just wondered if you might elaborate on some of the evolution and effect of the Protestant missionary movement out there, to the extent that you've encountered it. You certainly have seen more than I have, but any further comment on some of the effects of missionaries in those American missionaries in those environments?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And my goodness, I could go on all day about this. I won't, but I'll just put out a few initial observations, since it's an absolutely fascinating subject. So the two regions of the world where American missionaries historically, I think, have had the greatest influence, and in some ways continue to do so, are the Middle East and East Asia. I'll focus, some of my thoughts on East Asia. Some of the really first American encounters with East Asia in the early 19th century were missionaries going over there, especially to China, but also Korea, Japan. And of course, the missionaries' main imperative was to spread the Christian gospel, but they also became very involved in building hospitals and educational institutions. And so when you look at a lot of the development of East Asia, and a number of the universities and hospitals will trace their foundings back to American missionaries in the 19th century. And in turn, a lot of what Americans back home in the United States, first learned about Asian countries and societies was what they would hear from the returning missionaries. And this ended up developing a really interesting repository of expertise, so much so that if you look at the early days of the State Department Foreign Service, which is founded in around 1920, and then the early days, of course, of the CIA, which is founded in 1947, most of their early experts, whether diplomats or intelligence analysts on Asia, were either former missionaries or the children of missionaries who had grown up in China or Japan or Korea or a number of these other places. And again, as I mentioned earlier in the debate about, say, whether the US should diplomatically recognize the People's Republic of China in 1950, missionaries, often disagreed fiercely among themselves over what U.S. policy should be and what they had learned there with their background in the country. And so you'd see a tremendous diversity of opinion, but at the same time, a really interesting body of language skills, of cultural knowledge, and just great affinity for those countries and that part of the world. So you really can't understand, U.S.-Asia relations even now in the 21st century without understanding the more historic role of missionaries there.
Thanks very much. I was dying to ask that. We have a question from Bas Nabolsi before he gets yanked off by work. Bas, can you unmute yourself and put your question?
I can. I was hoping that George would ask my question for me, but here I am unmuted. The question
You're our chair. You got to ask.
Was in your view, do you think that religious interests are driving the nationalism we're seeing around the globe, or is nationalism, the interest in the nationalists, channeling the religious interests for their purpose? Which do you think is the leading effect, and which is the following effect?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Bas. And of course, I will annoy you and punt by saying yes to both. Okay, but that I'll try to be a little more specific. But it can be really hard to disentangle, as you put it, which is the leading effect and which is the lag effect. That said, I do think that more often than not, religion will be the more leading factor in helping to maybe foment or create and fuel some of those nationalisms. partly just using a little bit of the common sense test. In most cases, the religion has been around a lot longer than the nation state, right? So Hinduism has been around longer than, in India as a nation. Of course, India as a civilization goes back much longer. The Orthodox Church, has been around longer than Russia, and so on and so forth. So given that those religious identities and commitments and traditions go back even longer, and have existed through a number of different political incarnations. Usually, I think those are going to be the more lead-in effect. But again, it is such an interactive thing. And of course, nationalist leaders, like for example, going back to Putin, in his heart of hearts, what does he really believe about, Russian Orthodox theology? I don't know. Does he believe in the virgin birth? Does he believe in the resurrection of Christ? Things like this. I don't really know. That's between him and God, if he even actually believes in God. But he certainly believes very strongly in using those Orthodox beliefs and identities to maintain this hold on power, to foment Russian nationalism, to define Russia against the decadent secular West, especially in Europe and North America. And so in that case, perhaps some of the nationalism is driving some more of the religion. But I really think it's going to be on a case by case basis. So it's a very difficult question, but thanks for asking it.
Wow, thank you. Jason, do you want to unmute and ask your question? This has to do with Russia, I believe.
Yeah, thank you so much for this insight. And it's really a treat for us because it is really a complicated issue. Could you explain to us how did the Russian blame the collapse of USSR by religion?
Oh, sure.
What's their narratives?
Yeah. So it's a complicated story because it certainly has some grains of truth, but has also been somewhat exaggerated. So, but in the case of the Soviet Union, remember, because Soviet communism itself was militantly atheistic, the Russian Orthodox Church was severely persecuted under the Soviet Union. Something like, we don't know the exact numbers, but upwards of 50 to 60,000 Orthodox priests were executed, especially under Stalinism. Many of the Orthodox monasteries were shuttered, or the churches were turned into, communist meeting halls, what have you. But the Russian Orthodox Church was not entirely extinguished, and some elements of the Orthodox Church were dissidents, if you will, continue to be, pockets of anti-communism. The Orthodox priest Lev Yakunin is a famous example of this, or the dissident writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, for example. Obviously, he's a layman, but again, his Orthodox identity was a big part of his resistance to communism and his eventual exile in the West. But then other parts of the Russian Orthodox Church became co-opted by the state, where the KGB would infiltrate the church meetings and pay off the priests as informers, and so it became an instrument of state control. Then meanwhile, other non-Orthodox religious groups in the Soviet Union, especially Protestant Christians and Jews, became some of the leading critics and dissidents against Soviet communism. That's why you had the Jewish refuseniks, leading Jewish dissidents such as Natan Sharansky, and they were some of the most articulate and compelling and visible critics of Soviet communism. And so for Russians today, it's hard to generalize too much, but Russians who were critical of the Soviet communism appreciate the role that religious believers and actors played in being dissidents and prophetic voices against it. Whereas other Russians who are nostalgic for Soviet communism have now transferred their belief system onto the Orthodox Church, and this is where a lot of that nationalism is coming from. Now, in the case of China, as I mentioned, the Chinese Communist Party, of course, looks over and blames religion for the fall of the Soviet communism. They focus entirely on the dissidents, both within the Soviet Union, the religious dissidents within the Soviet Union, as well as people like Pope John Paul II and other religious leaders who were critics of communism outside. And they think the problem is that Soviet communism didn't eliminate enough, wasn't tough enough on religion, didn't shut down all the churches, didn't put all the religious believers in the gulag or execute them. And so that's a big part of what is driving, for example, Xi Jinping's repression of the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, or of the house churches, Protestants, or his refusal again to recognize Vatican authority over bishop appointments, things like that. So, hope that at least touches on it some. Again, it's a complicated topic.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, we do have a question. Bob Larick, if you could read that question you have in that one box of yours, I think it's worth asking. Please unmute yourself. Bob?
Here we go. Did I do it?
Yep.
Oh, good.
So yeah,
hear you.
nice question in the box there. So yeah, if you could read that.
How did we, I lost the question, but how did we,
Do you want me to read it for you?
religion is used as a tool for nations to destabilize as well as expand. Couldn't the Abrahamic Brotherhood also be used as an example of something that could be expanded to a brotherhood, sisterhood, of greater moderation and a humanistic state, which is something I heard the head of the Muslim League and also Simon Wiesenthal talk about it as well.
Great, thank you, Bob.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. Again, as with these, there's not a simple answer, but I appreciate some of the examples you cited, which is that when religion is most often functioning as a force for peace and reconciliation, or diplomatic progress, it's when religious leaders are focusing on the parts of their faith traditions that promote those values. So, most world religions, I'm not at all going to say all world religions teach the same thing by any means. I think that's very demeaning to people's particular religious beliefs. But most world religions have some version of the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And that's a good thing to teach your kids on the playground, but it's also a really good thing to teach diplomats and generals and others. And if we think in terms of that reciprocity, that can sometimes be, like I said, a really important beginning foundation or basis for peace building and reconciliation. Another one, I'm glad, again, you mentioned the Abraham Accords, is while Judaism and Islam and Christianity have some very important theological differences, they all do share, reverence for some common figures. Abraham would, of course, be, one of the foremost among them. Moses would be another one. And even if their particular beliefs about what role Abraham may have played as a prophet, for example, may differ, that common reference can say, hey, we do have something in common here. And as different seeds of Abraham, if you will, we should not be at each other's throats. We should not be fighting, but rather we should be working together. And so those can be, I think, some ways in which religious traditions can look within themselves and then find seeds or beliefs or commitments that can then, like I said, promote peace and reconciliation.
Thank you so much. Hey, there's one from another channel here, Will. Africa, and particularly, you mentioned Nigeria, but the Sahel and across, there's everything from the Lord's Resistance Army to the Al Qaeda in the Sahel and other things, and they all do seem to have some sort of religious overtones. Is there an anatomy and a thematic drive that can be derived from that? I mean, what's going on there?
Yeah, boy, no, Africa, again, very interesting, very, very complicated story. I would say that Africa and South Asia are going to be two of the most overall religious regions of the world. You're not going to find many secularists or atheists in those regions like you might find in Europe or parts of North America. But the religious commitments can vary quite a bit. And again, I'd mentioned earlier with American missionaries, the Middle East and East Asia being the two regions of probably the most historic influence, but Africa would be the other one right up there. And so with Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, you have very large active Christian populations. Again, both Catholic and Protestant, both high church and low church Protestants. What's been interesting there with a lot of those Christian communities is African Catholic and Protestant leaders are now becoming global leaders. leaders. And so, when you look at some of the most important bishops in Anglicanism, or emerging bishops and cardinals in the Catholic Church, or even more low church evangelical leaders around the globe, but many of them are coming from Africa. And so it's not just having a large number of religious adherents there, but it's where a lot of the emerging clerical leadership for 21st century Christianity is coming from. But as was mentioned, if we had a map of Africa in front of us, and we could sort of kind of trace a belt right across the northern edge of sub-Saharan Africa, which is where north of that is predominantly Islamic, predominantly Sunni Islam. And there's more peaceful versions of it, and then there's more violent versions of it. And of course, that belt traverses Nigeria, which is why Nigeria is so afflicted with sectarian violence. Then, of course, as was mentioned with the Lord's Resistance Army, you also have some quite radical movements in Africa deriving from different strains of Christianity, and that certainly seems to be the case with the Lord's Resistance Army. Most Christians, and I identify as one myself, would not want to claim the Lord's Resistance Army. That's not what we believe about our faith, but that still is that kind of apocalypticism and violent death cult that infects it is derived from some claims to Christian belief, and that certainly inspires some of its adherents. That's why it's been so hard to eradicate. But also, of course, some of the leading voices against the Lord's Resistance Army have been different Christian movements as well. So again, I go back to the main takeaway: you cannot understand Africa, African politics, African economics, African peace building, African violence and conflict without understanding the role of religion.
Great. Well, we're getting close, but I won't let you get away. You mentioned leading indicators. What do you have in mind, or is there anything that we should be keeping an eyeball in for coming, hopefully just keeping an eye on for coming years and months?
Yeah, so I'll tell you one that I've been following for, about 10 or 15 years now, but which is still unresolved, is the debate within Shiism, within Shiite Islam, over really two schools of thought. There's the more militant revolutionary school of thought embodied by Ayatollah Khamenei and the revolutionary regime in Iran. And then there's the more, if you will, peaceful and tolerant version of Shiism embodied by Ayatollah Sistani there in Iraq. And again, I'm not an expert on Shiite theology per se, but there's that, if you will, almost a battle for the soul of Shiite Islam going on right now between those two different camps. Numerically, more Shiites certainly are going to follow Ayatollah Sistani and the more, like I said, the more quietist, peaceful version there. But the more militant ones certainly have a lot more power there in Iran. This is why Ayatollah Sistani never wanted to be prime minister of Iraq, right? He believes in more of some sort of distinction between mosque and state. So insofar as we're concerned with the future of the Middle East, that's one big factor I'm going to be looking at. It's the future of Shiism. Then another one to keep an eye on is the future of Christianity in China. Again, by some numbers, China may have the largest overall numbers of active church-going Christians of any country in the world. Something like, we don't know the exact numbers, but around 100 to 120 million Chinese Protestants who are worshiping every week. And then maybe another 25 to 40 million Chinese Catholics, again, who are worshiping every week. Now, that's only, say, 1/10 of the overall 1.3 billion people in China. But in terms of numbers, so much of the future of Christianity is going to be determined by those churches in China. And obviously, the Chinese Communist Party is still officially atheistic and has its monopoly on power. And Xi Jinping seems to have strengthened that power. And I'm not predicting by any means the imminent collapse of China, but if the Christians in China to continue to have those numeric numbers and continue to quietly get positions of influence in business and even in parts of the government, they may want to take China in a different direction. And that's one reason why Xi Jinping is very threatened by the growth of religion, of any religions. But as we have seen with the 20th century, efforts to control or exterminate it often fail. And so that's another leading indicator, I think, that will do a lot to shape the future of China, is the future of Christianity in China. So those are two I'll put out there.
Well, keep an eye out there. We have one last that I want to squeeze in before we lose you here. Jim Hilbolt, do you want to unmute and ask your question, please?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Professor, I'm very interested to hear you take the same sort of analytic approach that you've applied to U.S. foreign policy and events outside the U.S. and apply it inwards to our own country. I think my proposition would be there's an increasing rift between the secularist sort of political correctness side of society and those who actually believe in God, whether they're Christians or Jews or Muslims or anything else. And so I'm just curious, what's your assessment of the state of affairs, religious affairs in the U.S.?
Oh boy, this is a tough one. So, well, I first will punt a little bit and say that it's somewhat outside my own expertise. Since I guess my expertise is on the foreign policy side of things. But since you asked and I've studied this a bit, I do worry about some of these growing divides that you've described there. And it's not so much the United States to exist as a country needs to have a strong religious identity. But there's a reason that the First Amendment does protect religious freedom and yet also guarantee disestablishment. Is there was a sense among our founding fathers that religious values are an important part of the American identity experiment, but also ensuring that that we protect religious freedom and religious pluralism rather than the state churches that you had, say, in Europe. And that bargain, or that balance, if you will, has certainly been stressed and strained over our country's history, but it's largely held. But I now worry that the strains are getting more and more acute. And of course, there's divisions within a lot of American religious communities as well over the future of our country. So I do hope that we can recover some of our better historic traditions there. But it's much easier said than done.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Will. And we've learned a lot today, and we're going to have a lot to think about going forward. Really appreciate your sending some time to us.
Well, it was my pleasure. You're a great group, and I'm so encouraged to know there's so many thoughtful folks there in Connecticut paying careful attention to these issues. So sorry I can't join you for your breakout rooms, but I'm sure there'll be no shortage of things to discuss. So.
I have a feeling that's the case. So thanks very much. Everybody else, if you want to go into breakout rooms, hang on, and we'll just take a second.